Okay, well, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to the second in this academic year's series of Greek dialogues. This week we have Professor Douglas Hedley, who's Professor of the Philosophy of Religion at Cambridge and Director rather of the Cambridge Centre for Platonism. Today he's going to talk about Platonic philosophy and dialogue in the works of the Latin works, of Henry Moore. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Douglas.
Thank you very much. And actually, this will be a joint event with Dr. Christian Hengstermann from the University of Wuppertal. You'll see that, like our 17th century predecessors, we're a pretty cosmopolitan bunch. But much of that anon. So this evening, we're going to be talking about the most important Platonic school between the Renaissance and the Romantic period. So the Cambridge Platonists. Now, there are a few points that I want to make about this group, and these are just a few very simple points for clarification. So, first of all, these are Christian Platonists. They are in an Alexandrian tradition, and the figures that I'll be talking about, particularly Henry Moore, see Plotinus and Origen as the foundational figures of of what they regard as Platonism. And the Origen they assume is the just one and the same Christian origin, so they're not worried about the identity of Origen. For them, Origen and Plotinus are both products of the Alexandrian Platonic school, and they were both warming their bottoms on the lecture halls of Ammonius Saccas. Now, the philosophical dimension of this looks as follows. So first of all, they are asserting spiritual reality, intelligible reality, against the materialism, as the ancient Platonists did, of the Stoics and Epicureans, and of course updating this into the 17th century against Hobbes. They are epistemological realists, so they are attacking skepticism, just as the Middle and Neoplatonists did. And furthermore, they are insisting upon the goodness of the universe. So just as Plotinus attacked the Gnostics, so too the Cambridge Platonists, I think, are the font of a sense of the beauty and goodness of the cosmos that you can find the legacy of that in Wordsworth and in many ways parallels in the 17th century English poet Traherne. Now, linked to this notion of the goodness of the universe is the centrality of the goodness of God as the archetype of the image that is the good cosmos. And finally, the insistence upon freedom. Now, this insistence upon freedom that we'll come to is the, again, remodeled in the 17th century context, attacking the predestinarian Calvinism of Cambridge of the 17th century, also Calvinism, also Hobbes, and indeed we'll come to see Spinoza. So this is a deeply learned humanistic Platonism, drawing in particular on these Alexandrian sources, but as it were retooled to take on 17th century opponents. And this is a tradition that lived on in Cambridge. Coleridge and Morris F.D. Morris were great admirers of the Cambridge Platonists. Westcott, some of you will have walked past Westcott House, came out of that tradition, and indeed the reviver of the study of Plotinus in Britain in the late 19th, early 20th century. William Ralph Ing, my name rhymes with sting, was a pupil of Westcott. And so there's a direct line, one might say, from the proper study of Neoplatonism in the 20th century through the 19th century successors into the 17th century Cambridge Platonists. So let's turn to the figures that you can see in front of you. And the first figure is a Shropshire lad, Benjamin Witchcut, born in 1609 and died in 1683. He arrived in Emmanuel in 1626. Now, he's generally regarded as the fons et origo of Cambridge Platonism, the leading figure. He was also quite a significant persona in Cambridge politics. He ended up as the Provost of Kings in 1644, so a powerful Cambridge figure. Now, above him, immediately above him, by the way, you can see that portrait in Emmanuel College of Witchcut, but above him you can see the portrait of Cudworth, which is either in Emmanuel or in Christ's. Ralph Cudworth, 1617 to 1688, is one of the two, along with Henry More, major figures of the Cambridge Platonists. He actually came up to Cambridge in 1629 when the university was generally dissolved as a result of an outbreak of plague in the town. So we're not the first ones to be in this rather odd situation. So we've got Henry More. I'm going to come to Henry More in a moment, but another Emmanuel figure, you can see John Smith, well worth admiring that splendid 19th century stained glass window. John Smith, 1618 to 1652. He entered Emmanuel at the age of 18 in 1636, and his select discourses are regarded as the most beautiful literary works of the Cambridge Platonist. Now, the central figure that we're going to come to tonight is Henry More, 1614 to 1687, who is a fellow of Christ's. But if you look to the bottom right, you will see his heroine pupil. So one of the first major women philosophers, Lady Anne Conway, who was born in 1631, dies in 1679. She was the sister of John Finch, who was a pupil of Henry More at Christ's. And More came to know Lady Anne Conway through his pupil John Finch, and she became his student. He visited Ragley Hall and spent long periods there, and she became a very important intellectual partner for Henry More. And some of the materials that we'll come to look at in due course are tied up with a very intriguing intellectual constellation at Ragley Hall, where a Flemish physician and philosopher, Van Helmont, was staying. Van Helmont had links with the great German Kabbalist and Hebraist Christian Knorr von Rosenholt, and through these figures there were links to such luminaries as Leibniz. So Here we have this sort of rich world based in Cambridge, but with links beyond, and also some of the major figures of some of the earliest figures of women philosophers in the 17th century, including, by the way, Cudworth's daughter, who was a considerable figure in her own right. Now, what's, again, the philosophy of these figures? Why would we think about them as a school? That's been disputed, particularly recently in the history faculty, but I think it is quite clear that they are a school. What holds them together is basically this Alexandrian Platonism. And I'll read this passage from Cudworth's True Intellectual System of the Universe, a particularly modest title. But this passage from the preface will give you a sense of the philosophical system as Cudworth sees it. And basically this is shared by Henry Moore. And here it is. Whereas these three things are, as we conceive, the fundamentals or essentials of true religion. First, that all things in the world do not float without a head and governor, but there is a God, an omnipotent, understanding being presiding over all. Secondly, that this God, being essentially good and just, there is phuse kalon kai dikaion, something in its own nature immutably and eternally just and unjust, and not by arbitrary will, law, and command only. And lastly, there is something ephemin, or that we are so for principles or masters of our own actions as to be accountable to justice for them, or to make us guilty and blameworthy for what we do amiss, and to deserve punishment accordingly. Now, one could say that he's summarizing Book 10 of Plato's Laws and Plato's critique of atheism in that book, but it's couched in even the terminology of the Alexandrian school. So he'll use the Stoic terminology of the ephemin, which of course the Neoplatonists take from the Stoics. So, and here we have this insistence upon these key principles of the Cambridge Platonists, of the goodness of God, which is directed as much against their Calvinists and the Calvinist principle of the God of double predestination, which they saw as sub-Christian, and also the Calvinist, the Hobbesian vision of the deity. So the conception of God that you find in Hobbes's Leviathan, and also the insistence upon human freedom. So, Christian, are you taking over, I think, at this point?
Gladly. I thought you wanted to say a few words about the center.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Yes, I will do. So, now, exactly. So, basically, from 2010 to 2017, we have been collaborating with the University of Münster. And that was largely because of a center devoted to the study of origin and actually editing and translating origin. And the Münster group was particularly interested in the Cambridge Platonists as representing, as it were, a high point of the interpretation and reception of origin in the West. I mean, so much so that I'm not sure whether I agree with this, but some of the Münster school, Christian included, have decided to call them the Cambridge Originists rather than the Cambridge Platonists. Now, we also set up or obtained a small AHRC grant and then a major AHRC grant in conjunction with the University of Bristol. And linked to that, I set up the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism. And mainly as a sort of hub for grants and for work in the area of the Platonic tradition as a continuous tradition, as a living school of thought right up to the contemporary. And one of those successes that we've had in obtaining grants is a Shirk project that we obtained with through the University of McGill on the reception of German mysticism in 17th century Cambridge, based in particular upon the influence of the Eckhart school on both Cudworth and Henry Moore. And there you can see some publications that have come out of this collaborative work. So Christian Hengstermann's edited work, That Miracle of the Christian World, which is on the reception of of Origin in the Cambridge Platonists, the Revising Cambridge Platonism, Sources and Legacy, which is a set of essays that has come out of various workshops that we've had. And there, next to it, you see the project that Christian and I are working on at the moment, a collection of the Latin works of Henry Moore being published by Peters in Leuven in Belgium, and with a particularly magnificent portrait of Henry Moore, recently discovered by Peter Lilly, where you can see the great contemplative Platonist in a striking, most impressive pose. So, Christian, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I would like to focus on Henry Moore now, who is by far the most prolific of the Cambridge Platonists or Cambridge Originists. So his opera Omnia is a 3-volume opus magnum made up of some 3,000 pages almost, and it contains an extraordinary metaphysical vision of great acumen, and contrary to common misconceptions regarding Henry Moore, of great consistency. And it has everything he writes has to do with what one could call his original insight, if I may borrow this celebrated phrase of Dieter Henrich. And this original insight revolves around the notion of divine goodness. And we are in the fortunate position to have a little autobiography written by Henry Moore himself. He included it in the preface to his Opera Philosophica. It was originally written in Latin and then translated into English by one of his later biographers. And it contains, with the benefit of considerable conceptual hindsight, an exposition of what he chose to call a firm and unshaken persuasion of the divine justice and goodness, at which he arrived as an early schoolboy at Eton College. As he puts it, on a certain day in a ground belonging to Eton College, where the boys used to play and exercise themselves. And he started wondering about the doctrine of predestination. He had been brought up a staunch Calvinist, but he began to question this idea. And he wondered whether, given that he were one of the unfortunate reprobates consigned to hellfire, if he were to mend his ways in hell, would not God have mercy upon his soul and save him despite all his sins? And this is what he subscribed to all his life, this notion of divine goodness, which requires as a corollary, as it were, the notion of human freedom. So God allows us to make our own choices, and these choices are deeply relevant to the fate of our souls, even in hell. And one could go so far as to say, well, that this is the unshakable foundation of this Christian metaphysics, deeply steeped in the Alexandrian tradition and all the other great representatives of this living tradition of Platonism, which Henry Moore was instrumental in reviving at the University of Cambridge and in the entire European Republic of Letters. So the first conversion was that from Calvinism to to a kind of Platonism prior, obviously, to any reading of the sources on his part. But then he experienced another crisis after starting his undergraduate studies at Cambridge University. He suddenly found his theoretical studies to be wanting and completely stale and unprofitable, as it were. And this is when he started reading the Platonists. And that's an important quote from the little autobiography I've already mentioned. And this is where this boniform vision of God, that is, of God as pure goodness that wills the salvation of all rational creation, where this vision is linked to the sources we are so interested in. For it made me seriously at last begin to think with myself whether the knowledge of things, he says, was really that supreme felicity of man, or something greater and more divine was, or supposing it to be so, whether it was to be acquired by such an eagerness and intentness in the reading of authors and contemplating of things, or by the purging of the mind from all sorts of vices whatsoever. Especially having begun to read now the Platonic writers, Marsilius Ficinus, Plotinus himself, Mercurius Trismegistus, and the mystical divines, among whom there was frequent mention made of the purification of the soul and of the purgative course that is previous to the illuminative, as if the person that expected to have his mind illuminated of God was to endeavor after the highest purity. Here you have this expression of the primacy of practical reason conceived of along Platonic lines, right? Purgation is the sine qua non of any metaphysical progress whatsoever, and he links that to the golden chain of Platonism. So Marsilius Ficinus, right? Plotinus, the thrice greatest Mercurius Trismegistus. So we've got this grand tradition of the ancient theology, which he wants to revive and refine in a constant dialogue, both with his pupils and his philosophical opponents. So More is a Platonist in his metaphysical convictions, but he's also a Platonist when it comes to the literary genre he employed to express these convictions. And that's the dialogue, above all. He wrote a work entitled Divine Dialogues, in which several of his pupils engage in a really vivid and authentic dialogue with their teacher, with Henry More himself. And importantly, he wrote down most of his philosophy, or a huge part of his philosophy, in epistolary treatises. So he corresponded with the greatest celebrities of the then European Republic of Letters, like René Descartes and Robert Boyle. He wrote letters against Spinoza, against Jakob Böhme, against the Kabbalah, also corresponding with Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, Francis Mercurius von Helmont, and all the major representatives of intellectual history at that time. He was an extraordinarily prolific and versatile Neo-Latin writer who excelled in a great many genres. So shortly after his second conversion, he actually wrote several poems in a great variety of Greek and Latin meters. He composed didactic epics and epilia in archaic Spenserian English, to which he kept adding treatises in several different meters, as I've already said. So he started writing that and completed the original work in 1640, then published it at the behest of his closest friends in 1642, and then added another great poem that tells us a lot about his philosophical convictions at that time. He added that to this volume of metaphysical poetry, and it was entitled Democritus Platonisans. As I've said, the inspiration of this poetry is Spenserian, but he's clearly indebted to the classical tradition. He actually calls Plotinus in particular his Platonissa, his Platonist muse, as it were. But this is no quaint Platonism that he revives in some kind of bookish love for the tradition, but he tries to refine it in light of the most recent developments in European science and philosophy. This is why this work is entitled Democritus Platonisms, that is the Platonizing Democritus. That is, he subscribes to the atomist science of his day, but also tries to reinterpret it using the categories of his Platonism. And the two most important Platonici or Platonic muses certainly were Plotinus and Origen. More actually prided himself on being the first in Cambridge to own a complete edition of Plotinus's Ennead, and you can clearly see that from his early poetry, which abounds in translations made by himself and very learned commentaries added to these poems. He derives from Plotinus a whole cosmology which he entitles a universal octoad. The world in its entirety is made of ahas, or the one at the top, eon or eternal intellect, and psyche. And this trinity, this Platonic trinity, gives life to a cosmos of atom lives, all of which are animated by divine goodness. But he also mentions a heterodox Christian church father called Origen, whom he extols as a holy sage. And this is as important as Plotinus for his intellectual development, because connected to the Alexandrian tradition of Platonism is the concern with divine goodness, and even the superiority of divine goodness to divine oneness. So we can see that in all the Cambridge Platonists, but especially in Henry Moore, they reject this large tradition of the ineffability of the first principle, but vote for divine goodness instead. And as you can see, this has to do with this initial vision he experienced, the vision of God's universal goodness. And the longer he reflected upon this conversion experience of his, the more refined vocabulary he came up with to really express the epistemological convictions that he had been guided by without knowing himself. And there's a particularly fascinating text from his early period in which we can see this translation of the grand Platonic tradition in terms of divine goodness. So it's from 1651, one of his earliest philosophical texts. But I say that a free, divine, universalized spirit is worth all. How lovely, how magnificent a state is the soul of man in, when the life of God inactuating her shoots her along with himself through heaven and earth, make her unite with, and after a sort feel herself animate the whole world as if she had become God and all things. This, the precious clothing and rich ornament of the mind, far above reason or any other experiment. This is to become deiform, to be thus suspended, not by imagination, but by union of life, kentron, synapsanta, joining centers with God, and by a sensible touch to be held up from the clotty, dark personality of this compacted body. Here is love, here is freedom, here is justice and equity in the super essential causes of them. He that is here looks upon all things as one, and on himself, if he then can mind himself, as a part of the whole, and so hath no self-interest, no unjust malicious plot, no more than the hand hath against the foot, or the ear against the eye. This is to be Godded with God, and Christed with Christ, if you've been loved with such affected language. As you can see, this is clearly Neoplatonic mysticism. We've got the quote from Ennead 6:7, kentron synapsatau, which may be which may be the most widespread quotation from Plotinus in all of Moore's writings, but it is connected to the idea of a free, divine, universalized spirit, a divine goodness that gives birth and life to the whole of reality. And as we come to identify with this first principle of all things, we actually participate in its descent too. feeling as though we ourselves actually united with the principle and shared its riches with the whole of reality. He valued this insight so much that he actually returned to this principle in the preface general to a collection of several philosophical writings a decade later. In the 1650s, he chose to write philosophical prose instead. He had corresponded with Descartes and was generally recognized as England's leading Cartesian, who had introduced Cartesian physics at the University of Cambridge. Well, where he parted ways with Descartes was on the question of the first principle of human cognition. And again, you see, he draws on the Platonist tradition while addressing key questions, or the key questions, of early modern philosophy, namely the basis of all human knowledge. And again, he refers to this sense of something in me, as he says, while I thus speak, which I must confess is of so retruse a nature that I want a name for it, that is, lack a name for it, unless I should venture to term it divine sagacity, which is the first rise of successful reason, especially in matters of great comprehension and moment, and without which a man is, as it were, a thick wood, and may make infinite promising attempts, but can find no open champagne where one may freely look about him everywhere, the paidion tes aletheas, without the safe conduct of his good genius. You see, here we have a crucial reference to Plato's Phaedrus, which is another important aspect, and this infinity of intelligible reality is derived from a principle superior to all reality, but it is not the one he's talking about. It's divine goodness, which is creative and salvific by nature. And this is considered by More to be the first principle of all reasoning. In order to arrive at knowledge, I must relate it to this first source. He went on to produce two widely read enchiridia, or handbooks, both on ethics and metaphysics. And the ethical manual is actually a treatise on epistemology, or at least several of the key chapters are devoted to that principle again. And this is when he started calling it the Boniform faculty. By that time, he had developed an ontology of his own, a new and deeply original take on Plato's celebrated Deutsche Recluse, or second sea voyage. He never wavered in his commitment to a realm of spiritual reality above all visible things, but contrary to Descartes in particular, he viewed spirit as extended too. So it was different from body by being indivisible or indiscernible, as he called it, and penetrable, whereas body was considered by him discernible and impenetrable. So he subscribed to a strict university in being and goodness alike, viewing the goodness as the first principle, as our most deeply held moral convictions, and in ontology as extension shared by body and spirit alike. He elaborated on his deiform or boniform vision in that treatise, distinguishing between two aspects of this original insight, which he expressly called the chief criterion of all reasoning. So not only is the divine sagacity the first principle of successful reasoning, as he says in the preface to his collection of philosophical writings, but it's also, as he puts it, that rule or boundary whereby reason is examined and approves itself. It has a first aspect, and this is directed towards divine transcendence. So we encounter a reality far beyond the visible world. And secondly, it's directed to God's ubiquity, as he shares with us, and everything that is the riches of his own fullness. And this is actually the principle of our freedom. Because if it were not for this vision, we wouldn't know that we are more than our corporeal parts, as it were. So the first imperative derived from that Boniform vision is, quote, to restore everything to that state of felicity which God and nature intended for it. And he actually says that without this vision, we wouldn't know about this higher freedom of ours. And it also informs all our knowledge. And this is why More struggled with the question of final causation all his life. Like the Socrates in Plato's Phaedo, who turned his back on Anaxagoras, right, after discovering that Anaxagoras spoke about the divine mind being the first principle of all things, but then talking about corporeal reality alone. That's Socrates, More eventually decided to view the whole of space as God's extension, that is the extension of the first primordial and perfect mind. And this divine space, which obviously is present to each and every atom, is actually suffused by what he called the spirit of nature, the sum total of God's formative principles shared with the cosmos in ungrudging goodness and generosity. So these are the key insights, and he changed his views several times. He underwent several volte-faces in philosophy, first praising mechanism and then rejecting efficient causation as a principle that can account for any phenomenon whatsoever without recourse to final causation. But what he never turned his back on, and we can view all of these ontologies as attempts to express this original insight, that's divine goodness, which must be conceived of as absolutely universal. And this in turn gave rise to this cosmology of universal animation, of universal final causality, which gives each and every atom, however minute, however insignificant, a share in God's goodness and fullness, and which becomes an image endowed with freedom in human, angelic, and demonic existence. And it's interesting to see that More continued to stay abreast of the most topical developments in philosophy, theology. And this is where Douglas's, Marilyn Lewis's and my edition project comes into play, because it will focus on his philosophical beginnings and above all on his major later works that are controversial in character and bear on these topical philosophies of the German mystic Jakob Böhme. You can see the development of his interest in Böhme and his mysticism here. And it culminates in a first comprehensive exposition of Böhmenism in 1670 and 1679. This is when the Opera Philosophica were completed, and when he added scholia to his earlier works. So a first major exposition of Böhmenism, which was to prove extremely influential in early modern Europe, because while critical of Jakob Böhme as a materialist and as an enthusiast, he recommended certain traits of his philosophy, because Böhme, like More himself, had viewed virtue as the first principle of all knowledge about the divine. Then he went on to take part in a huge editorial project headed by Francis Mercurius van Helmont and above all Christian Knopf van Rosenroth, and he actually wrote several commentaries on Kabbalistic treatises, once again subjecting what he considered the Jewish mystics' materialism to critique, but also finding nuggets of gold in the Kabbalistic rubbish, as he said. And finally, what can be in many ways considered the apogee of his philosophical production, he actually wrote the first theological critiques of Baruch de Spinoza, with whom he felt a really close elective affinity, but whose philosophy he rejected on the grounds of the lack of divine goodness in Baruch de Spinoza's monism of substance and endeavor. And these are the texts we want to focus on in a reading session. And it's one of the historical achievements of Henry More's Latin writings that she actually connected these three currents of thought outlined. And he did so in the Praefatio Generalissima, which we quoted at the beginning. Incidentally, he said, since I placed the Kabbalah of the eagle-eye boy last in these Kabbalistic writings, I chose to put the critique of the Teutonic philosophy directly after it. The reason is that I reckoned that the latter was exceedingly close to the former, considering J.B.'s, that is Jacob Böhme's, teaching about the corporeality of the deity and his divisibility in his aurora or daybreak, an error that he clearly was subject to in that work. However, just as I've refuted the foundation of the Kabbalah of the eagle-eye boy, so have I clearly shown that Jacob Böhme finally overcame that despicable error and attained the truth. So here we have the connection between the Kabbalah and Böhmenism, and he added Spinoza to the mix, decrying him as a Böhmenist. In one place, he actually says, "Behold, pure and puted Böhmenism." And it all has to do with the failure to acknowledge that there must be this first divine principle, which is pure goodness and beyond all visible reality, intuited by the human mind in the boniform vision, which gives to man indubitable knowledge about the divine. And as I've said, this is what the three of us, along with an advisory board of scholars, want to focus on as part of this edition project, because not very many scholars of early modern intellectual history are familiar with the way Henry More was the first to connect these three traditions and subject them to sustained philosophical criticism, something that was acknowledged by later Kabbalists like Wachter and above all Leibniz, who is actually quoted at the beginning of the celebrated pantheism controversy more than a century later. But in many ways, Henry More is at the beginning of these most decisive beginnings of Western philosophy of religion. Yeah. Thank you.
So, Christian, so F.D. Morris, the distinguished philosopher and theologian and Knightbridge professor in Cambridge, was comparing Cudworth and More, and he said that whereas the former, i.e. Cudworth, had the stronger moral basis for his mind and was less bewildered by fancies, there are hints and divinations in More which can never be discovered in Cudworth. And one can understand why Coleridge in particular was fascinated by the figure of Henry More. And in terms of, as Christian was saying, for the 18th century reception, this particular combination of Böhme, Spinoza, and the Kabbalistic tradition was absolutely decisive for the development of the Romantic movement. So we're dealing here with a figure of momentous intellectual significance. Now, we're conscious of the time, but perhaps if we could, just to give you a sense of how this edition will look, if we could just go through the handout. Yes, so we've got, our project is divided up into these 5 volumes. So the Preface General and the shorter philosophical poetry and prose. Then volume 2, 4 letters of Henry More to René Descartes with answers to that most distinguished philosopher. So the word Cartesianism was coined in English. The third volume is the refutation of the demonstration of two propositions and other writings against Spinoza. And the fourth volume, the critique of the Teutonic philosopher and other writings against Jakob Böhme. And then the fifth volume, the most difficult volume, will be the refutation of the Kabbalah of the Eagle-Eye Boy and other Kabbalistic writings. So here we are trying to present these Latin works, which of course in the 17th century and 18th century meant that More was the most widely read of the Cambridge Platonists on the continent. And yet, of course, in recent years, the fact that so many of his significant works are in the lingua latina, this has meant, of course, that these very significant writings have been rather neglected. I wonder whether we should stop there and perhaps return to a couple of the texts if people want any more specific instances of the sort of material we will be editing. I could perhaps finish with just this quotation from the early poems, where More says, necessity vanquished, or man's will is not necessarily determined to one thing. O goddess, thou carriest a spike and wedge in my proud hands and pressed down all things in a structure made up of liquid lead. Thou art wont to impose upon them thy fierce law, but doth thy regiment extend so far, O thou fiercest of all things, that thou bindest unto thee all things alike in dire bond? Thine is the earth, and so are the flowers which bring forth in springtime, and whatever it seeds in its dark entrails. Rivers go wherever thou biddest them go, as do salty waters and the celestial bodies which wander the width of the world. The air is under thy dominion, the rushing rainstorms and whatever fearsome thunder reverberates through the hoarse firmament. And if even all of this may appear too small a realm for thee, extend it to the underworldly shadows and seats of the dead, and to Tartarus belching forth horrific fires from its jaws. Add to that all kinds of living brutes and countless species of beasts and birds. Nature is thy possession, the one sadder and pressed down by the sun below in gloomy darkness, the other warmed by the ethereal sun and his midday rays. Thou art entitled to give to all of them, to put them in stern chains, and to tie them to one ineluctable thing with stinging knots, however the rest is not benumbed by this mindless law. No, mankind is free. It is like an unmarried virgin, not yet promised to the wedding torch of any husband. Many men rendered eloquent by love and by the desire of the night to woo her with their pleas and their flattering words. We feel that our souls are besieged by shadows, some from the seats below, some from those in the middle, and some from those high above. Indeed, Jove himself has descended into our heart in chaste play to inspire it both virtue and holy love. Hence, it is that our mind is free from the laws of eternal fate and the severity of one thing. If the iron goddess were to determine the notions of the soul, fixing it of old with iron nails, all of its assets would be fictitious and its freedom nothing but inane fantasy. If someone had made this up, it is necessary that he burn in the chains which he helped forge and sweat while rolling Chrysippus' cylinder.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's invite some questions now.
I have a question. Can I ask?
Yes, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, Douglas and Christian. Of course, we know each other, but I mean, I wanted to ask a question, which was, it was kind of raised to me from the very beginning, but it was reinforced by the last poem. Can you please put it back so that I can see? I mean, I remember it starts with "O goddess," referring to necessity, and then he evoked Jove also as part of freedom, right? So in a positive sense, what was it? Jove himself was descending, yes, indeed, Jove descending into our heart in chaste play to inspire in it. So, I mean, he's clearly using here kind of pantheistic vocabulary. I suppose taken seriously, not ironically. So my question is the following. I can see that they are Platonists. They're also probably Origenists. In what sense are they Christian? I mean, a Christian would never appeal to Jove or would never call necessity a goddess.
Yeah.
Christian, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. No, they also have a philosophical Christology and the like, so it's linked to the Christian tradition, and all of this comes into play in their soul-making theodicy. So God brings about the salvation of humankind by means of his pedagogy, and they subscribe to an Origenist Christology of Christ's soul being a fellow human being, very much like us, but undergoing incarnation for our sake. And this is something that changes everything for them, as for the Alexandrians, Clement and Origen.
Also, I mean, I think one thing to bear in mind is, so there's a tradition of Ficino and Erasmus. So as with Ficino, the antique gods have been, as it were, incorporated within a Christian worldview, but they are, they are integrated within this Christian metaphysics. As Christian says, there have been certain decisive transformations. So one difference between Ficino and the Cambridge Platonists is that Origen has taken over the position that Denis the Areopagite plays for Ficino. And also, they are operating with a modern science. So they're basically Cartesians and operating with the Galilean scientific world, unlike Ficino. But they are inheritors of Ficino with this very synthetic, one might call syncretistic view of sort of Christian humanism, which is taking in the antique tradition. So it's a sort of Christian humanism in the model of Erasmus and Ficino, even though it is one that is, I say, updated by trying to integrate Cartesianism and the whole legacy of Galileo. So those references to the gods are references coming from a genuine monotheist, but a monotheist who is quite sincere in his appreciation of the the classical literary tradition. But he's certainly not a neo-pagan of the kind that you find like Thomas Taylor in the 18th century, that's for sure. Or Gemistus Plato or others of that strand.
We have a question from Marilyn Lewis.
Just unmuting myself. I think it might be useful to recognize that this particular Latin poem of More, which probably dates from 1639, was very likely the poem that he prepared as a kind of handout, almost party favorite takeaway item, which was normally presented by candidates for higher degrees. More was taking his MA degree. He was required to write a poem of this sort, which would have been distributed for people to take away before he entered into a disputation, probably defending free will. We don't have any text of that disputation as we do, for instance, for his pupil George Rust. But the style of these poems was very much classical, mythological. It would have been expected that he would appeal to the Greek gods in some way. So I don't think we should take it in as any way a refutation of his Christianity. It's just the literary style that would have been expected of him on that occasion.
Can I come back to that very briefly, or should I wait for the end?
Of course, go for it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm probably suspecting that what you're suggesting is that we have maybe a different understanding of what it is a Christian today or Christian language today than people had at the time. But so let me ask it differently. I mean, we would say that a Christian would have the Bible on her table, on her desk, and then read anything else to understand the Bible. A Platonist would have Plato's works or Homer's work or something else on his desk and read maybe scripture to be inspired, but in order to understand Plato. What would these guys have on their desk in order to make the metaphysical philosophy? Scripture, Plato, or both?
Both, definitely, both.
And does this qualify as Christianity the way we understand today?
Of course.
Yes, well,
Okay, thank you.
Donna. Nice to see you, Donna.
A very short, thank you for having me join. I'm outside of this range of this field. This is my first introduction into this, but I'll do anything to do with Nachleben of Plato. And you mentioned in the talk and then Marilyn Lewis in your question, the style. I was wondering whether in the plans for these 5 volumes, or has already there been done any work on the style, on the language and style and the artistry of More, because he was mentioned in the introductory lecture, what a beautiful style. Not only he, but some of these others, like John Smith, some of these others. Is there any kind of plan to include, or has there already been done? And
well,
about his kind of Latin, and you mentioned Ficino, influence of Latin or Latins or anything like that.
Yes, I should say one of the great charms of these writers is that it's the great age of English prose from Shakespeare to Milton. So it's they are a great joy to read. I think More in particular was a very accomplished stylist, both as a Latinist and he's very much the poet philosopher. I mean, I think it's no accident that Coleridge was fascinated by Henry More, and Henry More, of course, is not now regarded as a great poet, but he was obviously using Edmund Spenser as his model. Now, I remember asking the great translator of Plotinus into English in the 20th century, Arthur Hilary Armstrong, about the English Platonic tradition, and just asked him where he thought the Cambridge Platonists came from, and he said, in his view, it was from Edmund Spenser and Renaissance poetry. And I think now that may be an exaggeration, but certainly the role of Spenser is I think extremely significant, both in content, that Edmund Spenser was an out-and-out Platonist, but also, of course, the style, somewhat archaic style, and there's a
style. I mean, in the Italian Renaissance, the writers and the poets were intertwined with the Platonism, and something I'm working on in the translation of the Bible into Arabic by the missionaries was done by people who kept jumping between writing very innovative novels, so like the pre-Proustian, novel writers, and becoming a translator of scripture, and I'm trying to scrape to see what kind of Platonism they may have had. So I'm thinking this intertwining between literary and Platonist religious. I would love to see what when these texts are, the Latin of these texts is Are you editing the Latin or are you publishing the English translation of them? What's the?
Well, Christian, you
Yeah.
I'm asking. Yeah.
Yes. No, and I have the greatest of sympathies for your interest in that, because I think he's an extraordinary Neo-Latin writer in his own right, as we pointed out, right? And I don't think there's any essay devoted to that yet, because More is an idiosyncratic figure, right? So he's a poet, a philosopher, so no one really feels responsible for him in a way, and this needs to be remedied, I'd say. And there are beautiful prose passages in his works. His biography of Böhme, for instance, is extremely beautiful and very poetic passages, and some of his early poems are really, really beautiful. So this needs to be studied, and the way his Platonism is transformed as a consequence. So Isidorus, what you said, right? So this debt to the pagan tradition then and things like that. So it's quite extraordinary. So, and bridal mysticism in the poem read to you by Douglas, right? So all of that makes for fascinating reading.
Yeah, there were some choice phrases there, weren't there? I remember the clotty body or something.
Yeah,
clotty is a great word. Johannes Wagner.
Yeah.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I work on Neoplatonic influences on Spinoza, and so I'm extremely delighted about these materials becoming available. And I wonder, so I have a question or with a number of elements. So I wonder, so More's very forceful critique of Spinoza. I wonder whether there are certain, or whether it is entirely justified as a critique of Spinoza. I wonder whether there is a way to rescue Spinoza from this very forceful critique. The reason, or some lines of how that could be done, perhaps, is to argue that the reception of Spinoza in England was perhaps driven by the association of Spinoza with Hobbes. This would be one option. Or one could argue that in the Cambridge Platonist school, there was this shift from oneness to goodness, which is then a starker contrast to Spinoza, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And a third line would be to argue on behalf of Spinoza's metaphysics, or more properly his ethics, the idea that joy and love are integral features of Spinoza's metaphysics in some sense, and a current tendency, at least in Spinoza scholarship, to identify Spinoza as a panentheist. So removing him from this more narrow identification of God with matter that more diagnosis in Spinoza. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what are the potentialities of restoring Spinoza from these very forceful accusations that More levels in his critique. Mm. And is there maybe a way to reconcile Spinoza, or at least in some elements, with the Neoplatonic tradition, broadly conceived?
Well, I think they're pretty minimal. I mean, Christian is probably more sympathetic to that enterprise, but I think the element that there are obviously elements where More is actually surprisingly close to Spinoza, but where he isn't, I would say, is the dimension of Spinoza's substance as beyond good and evil. So I think that's the fact that the substance of Spinoza is impersonal and cannot be identified with goodness, that means that it's really ruled out of court. However, Christian mentioned the point that Henry Moore develops this rather un-Platonian thesis of spiritual extension and space as an absolute space, as a divine attribute. Now you could say that's veering pretty close to the Spinozistic notion of extension as an attribute of the divine substance. So I think there are aspects in which Moore is perhaps closer to Spinoza than he would like to be. At the same time, there are reasons why he's pretty adamant in his critique, and he's much more sympathetic, I think, to Boehme than he is to Spinoza. Spinoza is the learned one, whereas Boehme is the didact who toddles in philosophy. But despite his errors, Boehme is closer to the truth than the rather pernicious Spinoza. But Christian, maybe you'd like to add something.
Yes, no, I agree. So in a way, Leibniz does what you have just suggested, right? And he actually occasionally draws on Henry Moore. So there are several longer passages in which Leibniz subjects Moore's metaphysics to very astute criticism, because he cites him as the chief representative of a kind of panpsychism, which is in many ways close to Spinoza. So I could also answer your question from a historical point of view, and interestingly enough, Moore is instrumental in this retrieving of Spinoza, as it were, because he reads him in light of the Platonist tradition and highlights some of the Platonist elements in Spinoza. First by connecting him to the Kabbalah and to Boehme, and secondly by not simply viewing Spinoza as a materialist and atheist, but as an imperfect theist. So he comes close to the truth, according to Moore. And it's interesting to know that Moore, perhaps not surprisingly, was suspected of Spinozism himself at a later stage because of the sympathies for Spinoza, and makes for an exciting constellation in intellectual history, right? Because we've got two unorthodox Cartesians who posit a divine extension, right, as an attribute of the first principle. So this is extraordinarily interesting. And I'd say historically, so we've got Leibniz who attempts that, right? So he tries to defend divine goodness while also subscribing to an ontology that is close to Spinoza's in many ways. Yeah, and as I've said, I'm really fond of Spinoza myself, but I agree with Douglas, right, that the question of divine goodness is something where these two metaphysics or these two metaphysical systems basically part ways. So this is why we focus on the boniform vision so much. So when it comes to the first principle, these two metaphysical systems are far removed from one another, I'd say.
Yes.
And you can't really reconcile them.
You're quite right that the terminology in Spinoza, the natura naturans, natura naturata, the amor de intellectualis, that's coming straight out of the Neoplatonic tradition. There's no doubt about that. But I think the question is whether the terminology and the content fit together.
Or again, Wachter does what you have suggested, right? Wachter interprets Spinoza in a Neo-Platonist fashion, and of course this was deeply relevant for the later idealists, Schelling and these people.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we said we'd go on for an hour. We've gone on well over that because of the quality of the contributions and also the interest that they've stimulated. And so thank you very much, particularly to Christoph and Douglas for giving us such a fascinating talk. But thank you very much also to those of you who've come along and made it such a rich discussion afterwards. So thank you all very warmly. We hope to see you again at future Greek dialogues for the Cambridge Centre of Greek Studies.